and welcome back to the Bill Brief, the podcast where we break down legislation, what it says, why it matters, and how it could shape our communities. I'm your host, DJ William, and today we're covering S 1180, which is the Abolish TSA Act of 2025. So basically, this bill proposes to abolish the TSA entirely within 3 years. So the TSA, in long form, is the Transportation Security Administration, and it's been the face of airport security since like the early 2000s. But this bill argues that it's time for a completely new change, a complete new model. And the reason this bill is just super important is because the TSA has been very controversial, especially recently, and it's because of these known invasive screening procedures, privacy concerns, and just overall inefficiency within the TSA. So it's super important that we discuss this. The bill was sponsored by Senator Mike Lee, and it was introduced to the Senate on March 27th of last year, so in 2025. So let's get into the major provisions of this bill. What does this bill do? The first main provision of this bill is it requires the TSA to be abolished in 3 years. Something different about this bill or this legislation as a whole, that's something that we haven't talked about before, is it doesn't ask for immediate action. It doesn't ask for the TSA, this agency, to disappear immediately. It says that it must be fully gotten rid of or like fully dissolved within 3 years. So it's saying, okay, take 3 years and then the TSA needs to be completely abolished after this bill becomes law. So the second thing that this bill asks is for the Department of Homeland Security, the DHS, to create a full reorganization plan. So it gives them exactly 90 days to send Congress a detailed plan explaining a bunch of different specificities. These include how the TSA is going to be dismantled, how it's going to be gotten rid of, how the responsibilities are going to be transferred, which is super important, right? Because the TSA is a major agency that, as we said in the beginning, is literally the face of airport security, transportation security. So who's going to take over that responsibility? And then lastly, how employees, equipment, assets, right? How all of these basically come together because they form the TSA. So how are they going to move to new agencies? How are they going to move to private contractors? We're going to get into this more in the counter arguments and the implications. But if you really think about it, there are so many people who work with the TSA, right? We can actually, let's search this up right now. How many employees, work for the TSA? It says nearly 65,000 employees. That is crazy. Oh my goodness, that is crazy. And that comes directly from TSA.gov. So if it comprises of nearly 65,000 employees, that means there are so many people that could be out of a job. So how is this bill going to prevent that? That's the main question. Okay, the third major thing that this bill would put into practice is the creation of a new office, right? It has to include a plan with the creation of the Office of Aviation Security Oversight. So this has to be located in the Federal Aviation Administration, and the office basically oversees airport screening, but it does not perform the screenings itself. That is what diverts itself from the TSA. Okay. The fourth thing that this bill does, and this is something that I was super curious about and a little bit concerned about actually, but it transfers ownership to private screening companies. So all aviation security activities. This includes screening passengers, screening luggage. And okay, we're going to get a little bit sidetracked here, but this really reminded me of the movie Carry On from Netflix. I think it got released like 2 years ago, or maybe 1 year ago. I'm not completely sure, but that was when the TSA really came into play, and airport security was super important there because they were trying to make sure that this bag that had a bomb on it didn't get on the plane. And it was a crazy movie, and that's what kind of got me even thinking about the importance of airport security. I mean, that was a wild ride, but Getting back on topic here, it transfers the ownership to private screening companies, right? So basically, when you screen passengers and when you screen luggage, they're making sure with this bill that all of that is going to be transferred to qualified private security companies. So it's similar to the TSA, but instead of the TSA, we're having private companies monitor the screening of passengers and luggage. I don't know, right? Definitely something to think about there. Okay, the fifth one here is something that I know I keep using the word something, but it's, I was just kind of, this whole entire bill is making me think, okay, wait, yes, oh, wait, no, because I'm like, yes, this is cool, and then no. So this is one of those where it's like there could be a reduction in TSA staff. So because the responsibilities are going to shift, right? The TSA is no longer going to be needed, so the workforce is going to gradually decline. And you could deny this as much as you want. I tried to at first. But when we really think about it, right, we think of the reality of the concept coming into practice, coming to play, we can see that it's going to decline and definitely will decline when the agency shuts down. But even in that 3-year process, there is going to be decline. And it's really, really sad to think about. Okay. The next one is also something very interesting. The transportation duties are going to move to the Department of Transportation. So basically, mass transit, freight rail, other non-aviation security areas that were just previously they were managed by the TSA. Now they're going to be moved over to the Department of Transportation. Okay. So now moving on to the seventh provision of this legislation is this also got me thinking about search and seize. Like one of the amendments, the Fourth Amendment, I believe that you cannot search without a warrant. Let me actually clarify that is the Fourth Amendment. Yes, unreasonable searches and seizures. That is the Fourth Amendment. So this bill says no warrantless searches. Basically, when we have the reorganized system, and that's what's been a problem with the TSA is just ineffective searches, right? Screening processes are just not working. They're getting into people's space, getting into people's privacy. So with this new legislation passing, the system can't include any requirement that private contractors conduct warrantless searches or seizures. So they have to have a warrant to be able to search. This is super duper important. Okay. And lastly, and I would say most importantly, because it kind of comprises all of these provisions into one, like a conglomerate, the DHS has to report their progress every 30 days once this legislation passes. So nobody's in the dark here. Everybody knows what's happening literally every 30 days. And then the GAO, which is the U.S. Government Accountability Office, has to review all the compliance related to this bill every 180 days. So they're very specific in their day count here. Nothing's going to be happening without these important organizations knowing about it, these important security groups knowing about it. And lastly, most importantly, the Congress has to apply and approve the final reorganization plan. So they have to apply it into practice and then they have to approve it. Once the organization plan for what's going to happen now that the TSA isn't here gets sent out, they're going to be like, yes or no. And if they say no, well, then everything needs to be changed. A new plan needs to come out. So this is super important as well. Okay, so now let's quickly talk about the implications here. So what does this mean? The positive implications could cause faster airport security. Private companies may introduce faster lines, more efficient scanning processes, better customer service, and maybe even updated technology, right? Because their technology is just constantly growing. We have AI, we have way faster things to do. So maybe we don't have to wait in a 3-hour line when we go to the airport anymore, which is definitely a plus. But also, we want to make sure that there is safety and things don't go wrong. Because when you think about, someone getting on a flight with a weapon or not being able to be a person who's allowed on that flight, the very thought scares me, and I'm sure it scares you too. But the thing is, local airports that already use these private screeners report shorter wait times. So that's something to think about as well, because you may say, okay, maybe if we have private screeners, it's not going to be shorter wait times. But the airports that do use private screeners have reported this. So we can see this already in play. The next thing is stronger accountability. Right now, we don't have that much accountability, but now with the GAO and the DHS, literally the main purpose of this bill is to make sure there's no more transparency in the current system, because there wasn't. There was none, with all of the days that I mentioned, the 30-day update for the DHS, the GAO being able to see this in 180 days. That is important because we need transparency, and then Congress has to approve it. We need that transparency because that is lacking in our current system. Lastly, flexibility and innovation, right? Private screening companies may be able to deploy new tech faster. They may be able to improve training programs, customize procedures for different types of airports, right? The bigger ones versus the smaller ones. And we may say, this is all based on an if. None of this is said, okay, this will happen once we pass the legislation. But then let's think about it. Why are they writing the legislation? To make sure that there is a more effective process than the TSA, right? So we can definitely ensure, and I can assure you that I believe this would be put into practice and this would happen. So now let's get into the counter arguments a little bit. Why do some people oppose the bill? Many individuals, many critics on the opposing side think that it's going to be a national security threat. Opponents that argue against this say that we shouldn't get rid of the TSA, thinks that it's going to make the U.S. more vulnerable. Okay, and I can see where they're coming from, right? Because right now in my mind, I'm imagining a perfect transition. We get rid of the TSA. We come up with this reorganization plan and we figure it out step by step, and it's just going to be perfect. But unfortunately, that is simply not the case. There are so many possibilities, so many ways that this could go wrong. And if the transition is not handled perfectly, oh no, literally, oh no. So I definitely see where they're coming from. It's important to understand that there are potential negatives to this. Other people believe in privatization worries, right? And this is like okay, yes and no, because we can see this happening already with the TSA, that it's very getting into people's privacy. But people think that when we have our private companies, that's going to be even worse because they may prioritize profits over safety. So if these companies are very into the idea of making money, they may cut corners a little bit. They may think, oh, it's just like a metal in their shoe. It's fine. So things like that are really scary to think about, because when you go on a plane, you want to be as safe as you possibly can. Even if that means, it's going to take a little bit longer, somebody's holding up the line, that's okay. But also not caring about it too much is also very scary and very worrying, the fact. So I don't know. This is definitely a tricky one to think about. For most of these bills that we've talked about, I'm like, okay, either yes or no. I'm like, I know definite side, but here I'm like, I don't know anymore. So it's very interesting seeing the critics' arguments, which is why we talk about counter arguments, because it's really critical, especially during this time where argumentation and dialogue is very important to understand the other side, right? The third argument that critics say is that the TSA isn't perfect, but it is established. It has a unified structure. It has a national structure. And if we get rid of it, it could kind of fragment the system, stop the system. It can make coordination harder, but those are all based on ifs, right? We're just saying if. And that's because we think that the TSA is our only option. But if we get rid of it, we're going to have another option, and it's going to be the safest as possible. I hope, right? I really, really hope. And the last one is something very similar, and it talks about airport inequality. So many counter arguments talk about this, how it could cause airport inequality, because there may be really big airports, right? Those really, really big ones that people want to visit, actually, even if they're not even going on flights. They're like, I want to go see this airport. And those airports may hire top tier contractors, right? There may be the best privatized companies, but those smaller airports, the more rural airports, they may struggle to find some quality vendors, right? And then that goes into, oh, companies cutting corners, just there for money, right? Those are the concerns that we have. And we really want safety to be a key when we look at this, right? Because, when we think of, oh, TSA and companies and privatization, the one thing that matters is that every single person on a flight is safe. That is what matters. And that there are no unnecessary deaths, unnecessary casualties just because our system has changed. And that's something that we should really think about when we decide whether this bill is a good idea or not. So I think, when we're talking about bills, it's really interesting and really important to understand if there was any related policy. So before the early 2000s, we didn't have the TSA, right? And airport screening was done by private security companies. So if we implemented this bill, we would just go back to how it was before, just in a different and more modernized way with new technology, AI, all of that, of course, right? And then there was also the TSA Screening Partnership Program. So some airports, like the San Francisco International Airport and then the Kansas Airport, I believe, already use private screeners under the TSA oversight. So they don't have the TSA, right? They have these private screeners, which is super interesting to think about. I didn't know that before. And when I was researching and looking into what airports use private screeners and use private companies, I saw that there were a lot. And this was discussed on various news channels as well. The last thing is there have been various reforms that reduce the TSA size. So there's been several bills in the past that not do what this bill does, like just completely get rid of it in 3 years. But there have been, restructures of the TSA, looking at some little parts and changing pieces of it, right? Privatize parts of airport screening, increase oversight in the TSA, but never abolish the TSA completely. So, what would the impact on the country be as a whole? There would be a major national shift, right? Travel experience would change completely. Maybe there would be faster lines. There could even be slower lines, possibly. There'd be complete new screening technology, different standards. The one thing is possible job loss, which is something really scary and which is also a critic argument. I didn't mention it in too much detail because we did talk about it in the beginning as well, but there are possible job loss. I'm hoping that that would just get transferred over to private companies, but I don't know how that's going to work out. If it's going to be efficient, hopefully it is. There's also an economic impact, right? Possible cost savings, short-term transition costs, and there could be national security questions in the country, right? If it's done well, the system could improve. But if it's done badly, if it's done poorly, then vulnerabilities could increase and the system just no, it doesn't improve at all. And that's kind of horrifying to think about. It really is. But I'm so glad that we discussed this today because the Abolish TSA Act of 2025 is very bold. It's very controversial. Most importantly, it's very significant at this time because it's reshaping America's airport system entirely, a system that's been around since the early 2000s and is making it from a federal agency to a private sector model. Supporters can call it efficient, but critics can say it's risky, and even supporters might say it's risky as well. So this is super interesting to think about. It really brought out my thinking brain. I was like, yes, no, is it? Oh no, and I kept changing it a little bit. I was like, wow. So this bill is definitely something that I'm glad that I had the opportunity to research and talk about today. So thank you so much for joining me and have a great day. Bye.